Hi, welcome to my session for this year's BAPT 2023 conference. It's great to be here again. I'm going to give you lots of content as usual. That's really my focus. I know some sessions are more interactive and full of breakout rooms, but I'm just going to have lots of content and knowledge and references and information on this topic of parts and the metaphor of an inner family of parts and how that relates to type. So yeah, my name is Richard Owen. I am an organisational psychologist, qualified coach, and I guess psychometrics and personality specialist. Qualified in a whole range of different assessments, from trait as well as type. I'm interested in seeing the similarities and differences between these things. And I'm going to talk to you about parts today, which is one of my favorite topics. Personality Parts is actually the name of my business, and I'll explain more about that at the end. But one of the books that got me really into this topic was a book by John Rowan. Sadly, he's not with us anymore. He was a British psychologist, and he wrote this book, Subpersonalities, in 1990. It's a really good book. I would recommend that. It was a great start as a I don't know, a history and overview of what had happened previously in this field of subpersonalities. Although actually, if you really want to read something of his, like this 2010 book, Personification, you can see this list, he's written several books, but the Personification is the latest one, and it actually contains a lot of similar material from the 1990 book, but updated. And personification, the word, I mean, it means to personify, to actually take something and make it out as if it was a person. And in this case, you can then have a conversation with it. So you can personify in coaching or therapy just about any aspect that comes up. If you had a fear of spiders, you could kind of personify your fear and put it in a chair and have a conversation with it. That's kind of the theory of personification. You'll be familiar with it when I now have described it, because it comes up in a whole range of different techniques and systems. A lot of people use that sort of technique in their work. So this personification book from 2010, that's a really good one. Definitely recommend that as a really good starting point. I'll talk to you quite a bit about material from that book as well today. There's an interesting talk as well from last year. That's from the OSAPT conference. Vicky Giovanna, who's also at our conference this week, and she did this great talk, Trimorphic Ethoi of Psychological Types. She's looking at the philosophy of these different eras, or whatever they are, the modernism, postmodernism, and then this third re-enchantment she was mentioning. It got me thinking about, really this idea and this mindset of parts and subpersonalities really fits into that postmodernism category, and Rowan talks about that here. The postmodern view goes the inclusion of all significant identifications, the decentering of the self. The idea that like this kind of unity of single self, something that was always taken for granted, but a lot of things can now challenge that, and really the phenomenology of everyday life, if you pay attention to it, I believe it can really challenge that notion that actually that we are one singular unity. And so multiplicity, as we call it, really does come into our experience. And there's many different terms for the same thing. So here's a few of them. You'll be familiar with a lot of these terms, ego, id, superego, complexes and archetypes, ego states, subregions, top dog, underdog, internal objects, imaginal objects, imagos, identity states, divided self, false or unreal self, little eyes, multiple selfing, energy patterns, potentials, blah, blah, blah. You can read the slide if you want to get the rest, but some of my favorites are obviously parts. Modes is a more recent one. Multiplicity, just the idea of multiple selves or multiple parts of the person. There's so many different authors, systems that have described similar ideas, really. There are these different subpersonalities in the person. Rowan here describes it as a semi-permanent and semi-autonomous region of the personality capable of acting as a person. And it really comes down to states. So you've kind of run into one of these parts when someone, usually someone you know pretty well, is suddenly acting in a very different way, a qualitatively different kind of person. And as you will know yourselves, if you've got family and people you get to know for a long time, you get a sense of that these things repeat, that these things come up, and you get to recognize how identifiable they are in the moment when you start to meet. And you don't often know which part of your partner or your child or somebody else you're actually going to meet when you come downstairs, even though you get a sense that it's all part of the unified kind of narrative of who they are. Some caveats, that a lot of this early understanding of parts comes from pathology. The idea is that it's when it's more extreme, there's a bigger dissociation between these parts, less of a sense of wholeness in the person between them, more kind of extreme switches between them, and so it's more noticeable. So a lot of the work has come from psychotherapy, clinical psychology, and others dealing with like mental health issues, let's say, or pathology, or conditions, ones of multiple personality, dissociative disorders, and there's always different ones with different names that come up in DSM over time. But there's a host of disorders that involve these similar kind of conditions. So the idea is that although a lot of the background comes from this, it's just the extreme of a spectrum of normal dissociation, like a normal range of multiplicity that's within everybody to a degree. Okay, and so when I'm talking about it, I'm mainly dealing with this sort of normal range that comes into the personality spectrum, personality sphere, rather than pathology. So as I've described it here, we're talking about qualitatively distinct repeating states. This part of yourself that you can see it's qualitatively different, and when in the moment, in a state of being, of experience, you can hopefully start notice these things coming up, and how over time those states will repeat, and you get to know that part of yourself or the part of another person that you're interacting with. Rowan, in his more recent book, talks about reification. That's the idea of turning a theoretical construct into a real thing, like objectivizing it, misplaced concreteness. So it's turning something, you talk about this part of myself, and it's like, it's not that you can physically go out and touch that thing. It's not an object, and it's kind of a fleeting state of mind which you can come in and out of. But some ways of presenting it do objectify these things. Having said that, though, these things do feel very real. I mean, in the moment when you meet somebody, especially say a shadowy part of somebody, in the moment, it's very real experience, and you can certainly say that interaction that you have is a very real thing with those people. I'm going to have questions at the end, if that's all right. I don't know if you can hold it or put things in the chat, because otherwise I don't know where I'm going to end up with time. But yeah, maybe just hold questions to the end if you can. And the other thing is, another caveat is this, this idea of parts. It's not an excuse. People have actually gone into legal proceedings into court and made the defense that it wasn't them, it was another part of themselves, but not the part that was there in the courtroom in that moment. And that generally tends not to work, even if there's expert witnesses and so on that come along and do it to defend them. So we are responsible for our parts, even if though we don't always feel like we have control over them. And that's part of the issue, especially when it becomes more extreme, that our conscious, our executive aspect of the mind is really offline at those points. We do kind of get taken over. There's also some other caveats around like the ethics. So myself being a coach, it's important, that when I'm working with this stuff, it's knowing the boundaries of when things are within that kind of more typical part of the spectrum, and you're not dealing with things that are outside of that and really more suited to psychotherapy or clinical interventions. So I'd recommend people looking at the ICF guide, the Referring a Client to Therapy Guidelines. It's a really good free PDF you can search for. So it really lays out some of the differences with therapy and coaching. There's again a spectrum of issues to look at. If you're deciding, having to make that decision for yourself, whether somebody and their situation is suitable for you to work with, and level of daily functioning is one really important one they mention. Is the issues that they're having, are they affecting their ability to function normally in everyday life, in their professional or personal lives? There's obviously a host of like diagnosable conditions and issues. Obviously things like suicidal ideation, that would be a red flag for most people, I would expect, in coaching. But other things, like eating disorders, even not making progress and being continually stuck and the same things keep coming up, and this level of you're working at doesn't actually seem to have an effect, that can also be an issue. But yeah, if you're looking at, everybody has certain issues, problems to a certain level, and it's all about this spectrum. And you can look at the duration, frequency, intensity of problems that are arising and start to assess, if things are just coming up briefly and someone's losing it for a few seconds, very occasionally in a not too intense way, that's again on the lower end of the spectrum, and you can imagine what it's like at the other end. And again, coaching and work is more about development and improvement, from being okay to hopefully being in a better place, somewhere moving towards a state of things being improved in some way, rather than a sense of like healing, fixing, not fixing. I think therapists wouldn't come across with that mindset, hopefully, but a sense of recovery from a less optimal state. And so the coaches have got to be aware of their own competency and whether they're feeling that they've really got the skill level and experience to deal with something. It's interesting that they're saying that coaches can deal with things from the past, or family life, or emotions. Some people would say, "Oh, that's completely offline for that's the world of therapy." But the point is that if it's in the service of working towards the present and the future improvements of the condition and state that they're in, then that is a different thing. And the idea of not diagnosing, although it's obvious with personality models, you're often helping guide clients to a point where they can figure out that there's something that's not ideal for them and that they do want to work on. If someone with type, for instance, is to work out and say, well, yeah, I really am one-sided in this particular dimension, and I want to do something about it. That's not a case of diagnosis, because it's not a clinical model, but it's using a model to formulate what that person needs and ideally helping them to understand it for themselves. So into the history of parts, then we've got some of the earliest things that come up are gods and goddesses, especially things like the ancient Greek pantheon. The idea, like, where do these things come from? And many people like Rowan, etc., would say they were created as a process of projection, that people like Zeus or Hermes, etc., were really projections of parts of the people that originally created them, and they had such a resonance with society overall because they shared these kind of archetypal or resonant qualities that people knew from their own nature, something about shared human nature that comes up, and that it's been again personified, put out there, projected into the world as if it was these deity characters that existed in a concrete form. and yet really it's a projection of something psychological. So again, that's one of the things historically where we can say, well, parts really originate in that sort of sphere. And then also the idea of spirit possession, and most people have seen films where these things come up. People are possessed by spirits, and sometimes it has to be exorcised and driven out of them, and there can be very dramatic scenes. So, again, the pathological end of the scale, you could say really that's what those people were witnessing in ancient times. They would put it down to an external agency or spirit like invading and taking over the person, but really it was almost an invasion of an internal part of themselves, just a separate part from the normal executive conscious ego self. So there's a couple of types of possession. The lucid type is probably one we're all familiar with to a degree, whereby we can be aware of a part of ourself wants this, but a part of ourself wants that. We get this sense that there's these different aspects, and we have an awareness of it. And that's the level most of us would experience it in phenomenology of everyday life. But then there's this, what they call somnambulistic, that's like the ones in the films, the unaware possession, where somebody has no idea it's happening to them at the time, like, consciously they're literally taken over or possessed, or it's like they don't have an idea it's happening, and afterwards they might revert back to themselves with actually no idea or memory that it happened, leaving everyone else in complete shock that it had. And there's a history in Parts' work around altered states of consciousness and hypnosis as well. There was a great history. I'm not going to go into that though. I'll go into Jung though, obviously, but it's a type conference because it's more relevant, and I like looking at these older photos of Jung from his earlier life, and most people have those grandfatherly, wise old Jung photos to show, but I really quite like seeing him when he was in his younger years. I think that shot's probably in his 20s when he was. It's from his. I think it's a wedding photo when he married Emma, but he actually looked at complexes. Complexes was really central to Jung's work and his theories. And when he was doing his dissertation, doing his research as a young man, he was looking at his word association experiments. He was giving people words and seeing what they came back with and timing it as best he could with a little pocket watch, probably, and a chain in those days. And so he was doing these empirical experiments around the timing and the content of words that people would respond with. And he actually had the theory, that complexes were behind those incidents when there was a longer pause, like there was an interruption, and there was something unconscious came out in the response, which had a I don't know, some relevance to something in their life that they were kind of repressing or they weren't quite fully aware of. And it carried on throughout his work, but even later on, Shamdasani, a great historian of Jung, has put in his book evidence that Jung wanted to call his discipline complex psychology. Complexes was so central to his work, and he didn't actually want to call it analytical psychology, which it ended up becoming. He actually wanted to call it complex psychology. That really shows just how important this was. And in 1935, so again, this is later than psychological types, he's talking about the concept. So describing complexes are partial or fragmentary personalities. That's his take on it. He talks about the ego complex. Assumes that it has consciousness because the relationship of various contents to the center or the ego is called consciousness. That was his theory of this again, just one part of ourselves, and when material becomes known to that part, it becomes conscious because that ego's part of ourselves has that sense of self-awareness of reflexive knowing and awareness. But he's also got we've also got a group of contents around a center, a sort of nucleus, and sort of analogous to the ego, but in other complexes, not the ego complex. The ego is just one of many complexes. There's one of many centers of the mind, the ego being only one, but conscious awareness would kind of have us think and believe that that is really the only one. And yet everyday experience of multiplicity shows us that it's not. There's active imagination. So Jung would personify and well, he would converse with parts of himself. You know, he would really have deep and very long dialogues with parts that would spontaneously respond within himself. So he was very familiar with this way of working. He describes the soul or anima as being a complex that can be best described as a personality. And he says that traces of character splitting in normal individuals are quite, you know, or an observable thing. He's saying, you know, it isn't a pathology issue. He's saying angel abroad, devil at home is a formulation of this phenomenon of character splitting derived from everyday experience. You know, that somebody, and again, this is interesting looking at situations, and personality research has gone a lot into situational effects and how that changes our personality attributes in the moment, in states. Another way you describe them as feeling toned complexes. So there's a kind of an affect that comes with these when they come up in the moment, in the state. They're accentuated emotionally, but they have a sense of their own wholeness and autonomy. You know, for us, experiencing life, when we do get gripped by these parts and they come up and intrude and kind of run the show for a short while, it's like a subtler version of that possession phenomenon, really, that, you know, and the more you witness it and get familiar with it, you'll realize it happens a lot more than we admit, that these parts of ourselves come up. And it's almost like the conscious mind can suppress these parts. And we kind of self-monitor, and certain parts of ourselves we find less desirable. We might, you know, try and keep them down, especially when we're going to a new job or some other place where it wouldn't serve us or help us meet our goals. We can try and suppress the parts, but Jung says there's an effort of will, but they can't be argued out of existence, and at the first suitable opportunity, complex reappears in its original strength. You can't keep them down forever, he says. So John Beebe, his work's fantastic. Is someone that I've spent a lot of time learning from, because he's really taken typology from Jung's work and developed it in a different way, bringing it back into the depth psychology of Jung, bringing the idea of complexes. And he talks about archetypes, and there's 8 particular archetypes in his model, some of which were talked about by Jung and others, a couple of which, like the opposing personality and demonic, I believe, that is something that he created through his observation and clinical work as a concept. But the idea is that they are complex. The centers of these archetypal, there are archetypal qualities that these complexes have, the complexes which are separate centers of the mind that can come up and take over in different moments, especially when they're triggered by particular material that might relate to the function which each one carries, and the map of which functions, like here we've got NE, extroverted intuition, and SI, introverted sensing. This is the map of how each of these archetypal complexes, like the hero heroine, for instance, or the anima animus at the bottom, carries particular functions or mental processes, like the extroverted intuition, for instance, being the hero in this ENTP example, which is John Beebe's own typology. So he really brought this into the typology world, and he explicitly says he likes to speak of archetypal complexes as typical subpersonalities found in all of us. And they're John Beebe's words from his book. So although he doesn't always talk about it that way when he speaks, that's part of his work, and it's part of Jung's work. It's really central to this way of looking at things. But with personality parts, I've really taken that as a much more central and explicit thing from the start, rather than it being a kind of extra bit of information. It's really the central to the way of looking at the self. Now, again, he describes these archetypal parts as centers of agency and identity, capable of entering into meaningful relationships with each other. And that starts getting us into the kind of inner family metaphor, which this title of this talk is about, that the parts don't exist in isolation. They're part of the system of self, of who we are, and there is a relationship between them. And so actually it's those inner struggles and tensions that actually cause us many of the issues that we have, and therefore working with them to kind of resolve those relationships is one of the central parts of working with people to help them move forward. And it's really important with John Beebe's model that he's talking about not some hierarchy of how conscious something is. That, we talk about the stack model of the 8 functions, which is often used in type, and people talk about it like almost like it's a 1 to 8 hierarchy of the most conscious and the least conscious. John's really clear that it's not about that. That they're qualitative positions. So when we're looking at this cross model here, each of these positions which carries a function is a qualitative aspect of the person. He calls it an interacting cast of characters through which the different functions may express themselves in the ongoing drama of self and shadow that's anyone's lived psychological life. He talks about the functions themselves, the 8 functions. Beebe often calls them types of consciousness, and he takes that from Jung as well. But I sort of interpret it even slightly differently to that they're really the types of psychological system or subsystem within the overall system of the mind, which themselves can be more or less conscious or unconscious to different degrees. And that's the point, is that we can become conscious to a degree of all of these, and some of them maybe more so unconscious, as in acting autonomously with that, or even beyond our awareness. So I'm going to talk about a few other people that were mentioned in John Rowan's book, people like historically that have done interesting things with parts. There's this lady, Virginia Satir, from the US. Again, she's sadly not with us anymore, passed away in 1988. But she was doing family therapy with parts. Basically, the same processes you would work with an actual family of individuals, using the same techniques to work with parts of the person internally, to again help to resolve and negotiate the relationships between the parts within the person. And there's even videos online. They're quite funny videos now, looking back in retrospect, because they're like 1980s clothes and hairdos and people doing things in what now looks quite a vintage way, but it's there, for us to watch, and it's really interesting. She would describe the person being like a mobile, one of those hanging things you might have in a child's room. It only works well when all the various parts are balanced. It's a really nice metaphor. And she's saying becoming aware of these parts enables you to take charge of them rather than being enslaved by them. Again, it's that being kind of invaded or possessed, to a degree. She had this, what I like the sound of, the parts party, and that would probably appeal to Nathan as well. I think he's done something similar with the type functions, parties, and that kind of thing. But a parts party is a process to that, of imagining famous people. So it's like, again, the projecting aspects of yourself, but like finding hooks for those projections, like famous people that might share those qualities. So you just let your mind create that, automatically as a creative experience, and then have interactions and get to know these people in a kind of imaginary dialogue and role play. And Rowan has described her work as this process of meeting parts, witnessing the conflicts between them, and then having this balanced like negotiation dialogue, and then ultimately having some sort of integration process. It might be a symbolic acceptance or unification, some way around those difficulties that they're having. And then TA is obviously one of the most popular ones that came out. It's one of the first or earliest sort of self-help books, let's call it, in sort of new age literature in the 1960s. You've got this games people play, Eric Byrne, and one thing that's different is that between, like, say, John Beebe and trying as a TA, is that TA is much more influenced by Freudian ideas than Jungian ones. So, and the slight differences to what that means about the way parts are seen. You can get some of the more modern TA theory from this book into TA. It's a really good one to do if you want to kind of catch up on where things have moved on to from the 1960s. There's lots of people that have worked on TA. The life positions as part of the model as well. I'm okay, you're okay, or I'm not okay, you're okay. There's all the very different versions of that, the combinations. And what I think is good is that that's really part of the ethos of type, especially like from the Myers-Briggs perspective. There was always this I'm okay, you're okay position that was built into the system, and I really like that as an equity between types and ultimately ways of looking at the world and mental processes. And there's a lot more to TA than besides the parts, which are in this model called ego states. And there's much more complex ideas like scripts that we build up about the world, and then they become visible in what we call games, hence the name games people play. And he's saying games are like sets of series of transactions with parts which with an unaware ulterior motive. There's something, again, driven often in something we've absorbed or introjected from childhood, usually. And again, that's the key difference really with the Freudian kind of history to this, is that it's what Jung would call the personal unconscious. It's the idea that what we're not aware of, what is unconscious for us, kind of maybe was conscious at one time, we were aware of it and it became repressed or forgotten. But then Jung's position comes much more from a grounding of everything coming from this more collective unconscious, like, blueprint of the mind, and then things become conscious from there. So with parts, the idea of archetypes, for instance, is much more about them being evolved and built into our system through, like, into the human general blueprint of the mind. This idea that they're archetypal, they're shared by all of us. There's things that have evolved into us, like, for instance, the ego states, parent, adult, child. There's much more of a focus in something like TA about what you've actually absorbed from your actual parent or caregiver, much more of a concrete life, real experience of nurture that becomes absorbed into these states. Whereas there's more of a focus in the Jungian tradition that there's some archetypal parent-like quality that all of us share within us, the potential to express. Okay, that general, much more abstract form of it is somehow within us as a natural thing. Yes, again, there's much more to the ego states that's been developed. Like, there's more different types of parental ego states, nurturing and structuring parent. One that we often call like good and critical parent. So again, these things are similar. There's always like good and critical parents that come up in various different systems, but there's an upside and a downside to each one. A nurturing parent can be very caring, but it can also be patronizing if you don't want to be cared for at that point. So there's lots of subtlety to the way ego states have been developed. And then there's even what's called introjected parent-adult-child. You become almost these nested parent-adult-child within the main ones. So it gets quite complex in terms of this. Well, are we talking about like the level 1 sort of parent, or are we talking about the child within the parent part? It becomes like this nested model. And you get these parts like magical parent, little professor, somatic child. So yeah, I've described the last bit, really about the Freudian Jungian difference. Internal family systems is a great one. This is a therapy model. Generally it's used more for treating more serious conditions and issues, trauma related issues with parts. But Richard Schwartz is a great character. He writes really well. He's got this book here, Introduction to IFS, Internal Family Systems. He's saying things that we each have a family of parts living within us. The parts have relationships with one another that resemble the relationships between people in families. And when he was starting off, people came to me at war with themselves. They were knotted in dysfunctional inner relationships, and not surprisingly, their outer relationships paralleled their inner ones. So often, if there's disharmony within, we know that can lead to conflicts without as well. He talks about a self state that's like a kind of I don't know, like a centered part of balance and calmness. It's a bit like what people talk about reaching in states of meditation often, in certain meditative traditions. But then there's these other parts, exiles. So the issue is through trauma and so on that the certain parts may become exiled, that may become shoved away. Because they're in pain, perhaps, and we don't want to experience that. Then there's manager parts, which try to look after those wounded parts, the exiles, and firefighters that can really do extreme things when there's a risk that those exiles might get exposed to the world. And that sort of firefighting activity can be things like alcoholism or self-harming or things like that as defenses. So he's dealing with much more serious issues, but overall he's trying to unburden the parts. And there's this beautiful way of doing that when you see how he works, and witnessing and helping to support and empathize and connect with these parts that need to be unburdened, and helping free them of the trauma and they've suffered. But he actually does something really interesting. Myers-Briggs is a description of the way people's parts have organized. And that's again how I'm starting to reinterpret Jung's typology myself as well. That really parts multiplicity is so central to it all. I'll just read this quote because I think it's really beautiful, actually. He says, generally all that parts need to unburden is to unload the extreme beliefs and emotions that keep them locked in rigid roles, is to believe that you fully understand what happened in the past when they acquired their burdens. In other words, you need to compassionately witness a piece of your own history. And I really recommend watching some of the videos of people working with IFS, and it's quite dramatic, when these things happen and you see a therapist working with someone in this way. It can be quite dramatic work and very deep. He's talking about how one piece gets upset and takes over, and we've talked about this before. It's kind of being taken over by parts. There's the dialogical self theory. This is something that John Beebe himself is quite a follower of, and it's more of a modern take on the parts idea that it's actually therapy based, but it's been more researched. There's quite a lot of research by Hubert Hermans and others in dialogical self theory, and dialogical just comes from the word dialogue. conversation, let's say, between parts and people working with the person and different parts. When people are working with parts, often the coach or therapist might have like different chairs. You may have seen chair work, like that's got a history in like Gestalt therapy and things as well, whereby the person would have different chairs, like physical spaces to move between and kind of embody the parts in different chairs and can move between them and either have literally a conversation between the parts with themselves, with another part of themselves, or between that part and the facilitator they're talking with. So Hubert Heermans talks about a society of mind and eye positions. And again, that's where Rowan goes in his 2010 book, more towards this idea of eye positions, where, again, it's almost like a subjective frame of reference, really, if you think about it like that. We're so used to kind of having the ego as our frame of reference, but you realize that when we're in these parts and when we become them, it's like we take on this different eye position. So eye becomes the eye of another center of the mind, not the ego. Voice dialogue, another one you can pick at old videos online. Really interesting book to read. They talk about energy patterns as well as selves and subpersonalities, and they really do get into talking with them, the facilitator, and physically separating them, again, different spaces in the room, different chairs, talking with the parts and getting the person to really just slip into the mode of these parts. And it's just fascinating, people, when they go with it and they trust it and they really do become qualitatively different, like, wow, that's the same person, but we're really hearing a different voice coming out. That lots of things can shift in their tone, their appearance, their mannerisms. You start to realize how you're really dealing with a different kind of whole when these things come up and people embody them. Getting really people to talk from the position of the eye position of that part, and then even talking about the ego from that part as if the ego was another person. That's that part really can separate and take that position of itself. And again, it's dealing with these disowned selves. And they talk about a protector controller part, and they've got lots of other ones they name. I mean, there's really no limit when you're personifying things to how many parts there are. Whereas a model like John Beebe's has got a very specific set number of prescribed archetypal parts. There's a broad difference in how granular you get with these parts. And they've got ones called like pusher, do nothing, critic, comparer, perfectionist, power, ambition, money. You can objectify all these things, and they've got the usual parent and child parts as well. So that's voice dialogue. Slightly more recent here, you've got developmental coaching by Tatiana Bakarova. She's an academic, I think in the UK. She's published a book through McGraw-Hill. I think Open University published it as a version as well. She talks about mini selves. That's her particular favorite term. But hers are much more granular. She's talking about like there's a kind of huge number of parts. She talks about various mini selves, becoming formed in each particular moment of time and reappearing consistently in the long run. So she's saying there could be a mini self that serves the organism when it's thirsty, or a mini self that's responsible for driving. So all these multitude of things you could do in an average day, you can imagine there'll be a mini self for everything that you do. So that's how she's taken it that level, whereas you've got a complete other end of the spectrum, like either just a 3, like parent, adult, child, or an 8-part model like Beebe's model. she talks about things like the elephant and rider idea of the unconscious and conscious mind. I think Jonathan Haidt might have been behind that originally, perhaps. She also brings up the idea of a narrator. Again, that's something I pick up on in my own work as well. That we do have this reflective narrator that gives us a schema or an idea of who we are, like gives us a self-narrative. And she says the task of coaching should be in the first place to make conscious the concerns of contradicting mini selves. Again, it's really about these tensions and contradictions between the aspects. There's this great paper that I found just the other day, actually. I'm not sure whether it actually got fully published in the journal it was intended for, but there's a preprint online that you can get. It's drawing together a whole range of more modern research that tie into this theme. It's this paper called Modes, Cohesive Personality States and Their Interrelationships as Organizing Concepts in Psychopathology. I mean, again, it's looking at pathology, but again, it can, on a lesser level, it can apply to normal everyday differences. And they call them modes, and that's just their personal word that they like. But they're state-like manifestations of personality that function as cohesive organizational units. And they've got specific profiles of affects, behaviors, cognitions, and desires. That's the ABCD of personality that tend to be co-activated. So they're starting to bring it into terms that really align more with modern-day personality research, like in the traits genre as well, which is great. And they also dig into the really fascinating area of personality dynamics, which again is taking off hugely in research now, especially there's academics in Germany publishing on that quite a lot. That's something I'm really, really interested in. So within, they talk about phrases like within individual, like within the person, and that's contrasting it to between person, which is where like most like trait research has its basis. It's really interesting that within person research is something that has always been much harder to do, and therefore it's not been as popular. But I think it's something that's about to take off much more with the technology to do it. So we're talking about but they even talk about within person typology of discrete states. The word typology is brilliant. Typology comes back, via other things. It's always going to come back. But the research methods and programs of research to evidence these things and that need to be evidenced to really validate this way of looking at things that we already do through type. It is only just coming into being now, like 100 years after Jung. He really was that far ahead of his time. But it's getting there. So they're putting out a research agenda for the study of modes. With things like that are huge steps forward, because if that gets taken up, then the literature starts to grow, and then there will be ways for this to be tied back to what happened in the past with Jung, etc. And again, we're talking about ideographic research, like multiple measurements in this individual person over time, which is different to getting 1,000 people to fill in a questionnaire very briefly, which is where typically, and then statistically analyzing it in a nomothetic way. That's how most research has been done in personality. So that leads me on to like my own work in personality parts. Now I'm not going to go in detail of like what I'm doing. A lot of it is really heavily based on Beebe's model, but I'm taking some very like ground up new ways of reinterpreting it and typology in general. So my mission with this is to like form a new interdisciplinary conceptual narrative and testable propositions. So I'm into drawing together literature on parts, on personality dynamics, on cognitive psychology, I'm going to draw it in a very synthesis forming way, all of these different threads, to create a new conceptual narrative that repositions typology, essentially gives it a new grounding or a new frame of reference, with testable propositions, that can actually then be taken into research. I may go on to do a PhD when I'm not so busy being a dad with young children. That's obviously the main issue in my life right now in terms of time. But this is going to go on for a long time to take this where it needs to be, and others will have to be involved as well. I'm hoping that by creating the theories and testable ideas, that people can then go off and do work researching it. And I'm reinterpreting from the ground up. You're going back to what Jung actually said, not just relying on a received interpretation of Jung via Myers-Briggs, right? I think far too many times that's the starting point, and anyone that reads Jung knows and understands that it's slightly ambiguous in many places. Jung develops his ideas, and what he said when he was in his 20s or 30s isn't what he's even said when he was in his 50s sometimes. So you've got to look at the bigger picture and more broadly his whole range of theories, including especially complexes, like I said, which is so central but never really played a part in the Myers-Briggs formulation. And I'm going to integrate a lot of this stuff together in quite a different and unique way, setting a research agenda and ultimately then developing assessments and methods of practice around it. I mean, as a coach, I'm already influenced by various models that some of which we've looked at today. Some of those ways of approaching a part's mindset within coaching. I know a lot of people do that already, and even people that work with trait personality measures, I know who use that as well, especially Lumina Spark, which is like quite a popular trait personality model now. And that's people are using that and working with that in ways of personifying the qualities of different aspects of the personality, seeing them as different parts almost. So one way I'm looking at it, I'd like to save type. That would be a nice mission to have, but it will be type without type. It'll be something else. The only way to save it, in my opinion, is for it not to be type anymore, but to go beyond and to encompass the essence and the core of what it was about, and just to put it in a new context, one that is not disconnected from the rest of psychology and scientific research. So that's my hope. We have some questions in a minute once I stop the video, but I'd like to thank you for coming along. You can contact me. There's a form on personalityparts.com. If you want to have a conversation, get into something more deeply, please do. If you or anyone else watching this would like to come along and experience some coaching along the lines of using Beebe's depth typology model, that's also something I do, working with people in terms of like personal development and relationship coaching as well. So yeah, please get in touch, and so thank you for coming along. Cheers, and enjoy the rest of the conference.